Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's two-part episode on gun violence on the Self-Care Sundays podcast. You may be thinking that gun violence and self-care don't exactly go hand in hand, but as we know, gun violence is an all-too-common issue in the United States. In fact, I want to dedicate this week's episode to the victims of the Stoneman Douglas shooting in Parkland, Florida, but not just to them and the two folks that I got to know particularly well, Jose Iglesias and Lexi Michael, but also to victims of gun violence everywhere, including our show's musicians who made our theme song, Four Wheel City. They use their platform to educate young people about the dangers of gun violence and to encourage them to stay in school. This week's guests are two really interesting people, Maj Toure of Black Guns Matter and Mike Martin of Raw Tools. Let's get started.
Four Wheel City, Self-Care Sundays. Yo. I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that a self-care Sundays and dreams come true. Really do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Self-Care Sundays podcast. We are excited for this week's guest, Maj Toure. But before we get started, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon. Patreon allows supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, including monthly maintenance fees and to pay our audio engineer. We'd also like to raise enough money to hire a transcription service to make our episodes more accessible to everyone. If you'd like to help us out, please check out patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. That's patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. Thank you in advance. It's the generosity of our listeners that helps this information be accessible to so many people in the first place. Let's get started. So Maj, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. The Eagles are the world champions and life is good.
So I wanted to start with kind of a basic question, which is what are your self-care habits and how did you develop them?
Well, for one, self-care for me is rooted in self-discipline, and seeing a lot of the things that I don't want to have, happen to me in my life, doing the things necessary to make sure that they don't, the things that are within my control. So, self-care for me is deeply rooted in self-discipline. And from a positive space, though, like, just more along the lines of, nah, man, I'm not going to not go to the gym today. I'm going to go to the gym because, I kind of want to be in a better shape. Or, hey, I had a cheat meal already, so let me chill a little bit. So for me, those things, it's like little things that you do during certain sections of the day, when you're making certain choices to, care for yourself and love yourself from a more consistent space.
So personally, I struggle a lot with discipline. So I'm super curious about how you became good at discipline.
I think about the thing that I want more than the thing that I want, like right now. You know what I'm saying? Like I really, really, really hone in on, nah, bro, if you do that, you're not going to get that other thing you really want. That's in essence, that's really all discipline is. It's like, taking a space where you're saying, I'm willing to sacrifice what I kind of want right now, for what I want in reality overall, and coming from that standpoint, it's like saying, you can't get $1 million if you don't get $1,000. And I want to save $1,000. So then I can enjoy seeing what my safe looks like with $10,000 or then even $100,000, things of that nature. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So really thinking more about the thing that you really want overall, more so than that immediate gratifying thing that probably after you get it, you probably won't even be as gratifying. It won't be as gratifying anymore. That's what I think about as soon as I think about stepping off my square.
So with the work that you do, and I didn't mention it, so feel free to, how do you think discipline plays into the work that you do and what you teach in your trainings?
Well, for one, conflict resolution and de-escalation is the ultimate form of, self-discipline, especially whether it's the gym or whether it's the gun range or just having a gun generally, a firearm. That's a last resort. And, our work at Black Guns Matter is firearm safety training, knowing the laws, de-escalation, conflict resolution. If I'm walking around and I got a gun on me, any person, you got little rockets on you. You have to be very disciplined and, to walk away from some conflicts that do not warrant you shooting somebody. That's only to protect life, So, in my work, understanding that, things can escalate very quickly from somebody stepping on your toe in the club to the club getting shot up. You have to exercise that discipline when you're the person with the firearm and your shoe is the one getting stepped on, and that to the extent of potentially damaging somebody else's life and even yours, because if you do that and you react with lack of self-discipline, you go to prison and that person could be potentially dead. So that's the highest level of self-discipline in regards to, firearms ownership. And again, even the gym, I might catch a case for punching somebody in the mouth. And it's like, nah, man, it was an accident. The crowd is the club is crowded. That was an accident. Leave it as such.
Right. So I'm not a person who's very familiar with guns and firearms. And as I said, I'm not the best with being very disciplined. Do you think that owning a firearm requires a level of discipline? Do you think, like you mentioned, it's the ultimate form of discipline. So do you think there's a level of maturity that is needed? How do you kind of assess for that, right? Because when we give people weapons or when people buy weapons, we don't test for their level of discipline, right?
Well, we do, actually. You fill out a 4473, which is a criminal and character background search. And, that happens at every single time a firearm is purchased, as well as, training in and of itself. When you get a firearm, you go to the range, you want to be most proficient at the thing that you're doing, even if it's just for sport, even if it's just to become more accurate with shooting. That training alone creates a certain level of understanding of what this firearm actually does. Then you start to understand civics and the laws of your locality and things of that nature. And you start to go, yeah, I don't want to shoot anybody unless my life. It's what naturally happens with most firearm owners, because most of the people that are doing shootings irresponsibly probably haven't had any training, probably aren't at the range, probably aren't familiar with the laws and things of that nature. It's training on several levels shapes you to become more disciplined. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And obviously most humans, regardless of, the silly smaller amounts of people that do the wrong thing with the tools, there's vastly more safe, responsible, disciplined firearm owners in the country than there are the small amount of people that want to be jerks. So, and most of those jerks aren't the guys that, got the training, or continue to, discipline their lives, so sometimes the practice and the art of a thing, if you're an artist and you start to learn more about art, you become more sensible. You're more respectful for other people's art. You're more respectful for other people's, different types of expression, even if it's not painting. You're less likely to waste paint when you're a painter. So it creates a certain level of discipline in most areas of life. That's what training does. So the irony of it is doing the thing and doing it responsibly not only puts you on the path of being more disciplined, but it also strengthens your path while being more disciplined while you're on that path.
So how does your identity inform your self-care habits with regards to discipline, with regards to the work that you do, with regards to the communities that you work with? How does your identity kind of shape the way that you think about all of these things?
Well, my understanding is that we're all connected. If my friends catch a firearm charge, a possession charge, not because he or she was doing something wrong, but because they didn't fill out a little piece of paperwork, you know what I mean, to have this firearm to protect themselves or protect their loved ones on their person, and they catch a case, I don't see my friend for that summer or during the time that they're in jail or during the time that they're, waiting for bail or whatever. Mm-hmm. That affects me. If my friend goes to prison or gets probation or gets house arrest, I can't spend more time with my friend. That's just an example of our interconnectedness. So because we are interconnected, I want as many people to be informed so they don't get, there isn't negligent discharges. There isn't, families, horrified by that negligent discharge. I want to make sure that, my friends have all of the information. I want to make sure that the bad people understand that, our community is going to protect itself out of love and self-preservation. By doing those things, and taking care of myself and informing myself and learning and passing that information, via our firearms classes, our conflict resolution classes and things of that nature, that's an individual self-care that translates into the community. This is actually community work. And if my community is more healthy and, caring more for individuals, including themselves, then you have a more safe, well-protected, well-informed, not only my neighborhood, but that information spreads nation and maybe even worldwide. So my identity comes from my understanding that we all are interconnected. And I want to give people, I want to respect my community locally and internationally. I want to respect their human right to self-defense by giving them those tools in the form of education, safety training, conflict resolution, because that helps make the world much more safe, much more responsible, much more freedom respecting.
Yeah, so we talked about community self-care, like community care, and kind of working together and the interconnectedness a lot in season 1. So I'd love to talk more about this. Do you, I see that you grew up in North Philadelphia. You're a Black man. I'm wondering if you think about this work in relationship at all to kind of the legacy of the Black Panthers, or in relationship to mass incarceration and disproportionate levels of incarceration for Black men. I'm wondering if those things factor into your approaches to this work.
Absolutely. Because let's start with, mass incarceration. A lot of those guys that are in jail are in jail for firearms possession charges. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Not because they robbed somebody, or not because, they're facing 5 years a lot of times, and federal time in some cases, for a firearm because they were missing information. So I definitely think about that, and it is interconnected. As far as, firearms and gun control in general, the root of all gun control is racist from its inception. All of America before, and even, prior to on certain levels, but all of America at a certain point, prior to emancipation, was a constitutional carry, country. Meaning you owned a firearm. If you had it on your person, you had it on your person. If you had it in your home, you had it in your home. You had it in your place of business, you had it in your place of business. After, people of color, natives to this land, people brought over from, other islands and other countries and other continents, fought for their, independence or citizenship. That's where you had, the slave codes. That's where you had, the first rules of, gun control. And that was based out of, hey, we do not want people of color to have these firearms, period. Because a firearm is a great way to defend against tyranny. The founding fathers knew that, and there's nothing more tyrannical than racism. There's nothing more tyrannical than, beating people up for the color of their skin. There's nothing more tyrannical than beating somebody up for their sexual orientation. There's nothing more tyrannical than that. And so when we talk about fighting racism or giving people the means to defend themselves from racism, and dealing with a lot of these laws that are subsidiaries of an origin that definitely comes out of racist practices and legislation, we're talking about empowering people, to fight against those types of things, to fight against. And when those people are aware of that and they know what the laws are, we keep them from going to jail. We keep them from going to prison. We keep families from, breaking up, fatherlessness because of mass incarceration. We fight against, things like gun-free zones. When 1990, when the crime bill was dropped by Joe Biden and Bill Clinton put that into office, when so many African-American males were incarcerated for obscene more amounts of time than their white counterparts, firearms ownership and those things came a part of it. At the same time, in that bill, that's when gun-free zones were introduced. Since then, 81% of mass shootings have been in gun-free zones. You know what I mean? So all of these things, we have practical data over the last 20 or 30 years minimum that shows that these practices, not only are they racist in their inception and have continued to be racist, they also don't actually work for the thing that politicians are saying they're supposed to help with. So by us informing the community, especially in urban America, where there's mostly, roughly 40 or 50 million Americans that don't even feel like they're a part of the Second Amendment, which is inaccurate. When we inform that populace, we cut down on the prison industrial complex. We cut down on racism. and we cut down on, homicides and negligent deaths. And that is how we actually can make the hood great again. You know what I'm saying? But that's based in information, a factual conversation, not an emotional conversation. It can be passionate, but a factual conversation and information that supports things that are going to end mass incarceration, at least for this thing, as well as respect Americans' freedom to defend their lives. So it's a holistic approach that we apply at Black Guns Matter.
It sounds like also with some of the conflict resolution work that you're doing, you're also thinking about young people using guns, gang violence, and kind of both what happens through, as you said, like accidental discharges and people improperly using firearms, but then also just in the heat of the moment, people using firearms in ways that cause harm that they may end up regretting.
Absolutely. A lot of the younger people have never really shot their firearm, before. They have it, but they've never really used it. They may not have been to the range, so forth and so on. So the first experience of them using their firearm may be in what they think is a life or death situation that actually isn't, So by giving them that understanding and taking those young people to the range and letting them see what that 9 or that 40 cal actually does, they have a different understanding. There's a respect for the tool. So and by telling them, hey, this is a last resort, the reality is you should be walking away from conflict and informing and drilling that lesson into young people's heads. Again, that ties back into young people we're talking about a paradigm and thought process shift that gets that young person to understand the respect for the tool and more than likely not going to jail, especially if that young person is, let's say they're 19 and then they want to get their license to carry at 21. That gives them incentive to stay out of the prison system, losing, being labeled a felon and those things, so they can stay in position to have a smooth transition into being a licensed to carry person. It all ties in, especially to the young people, because they, as cheesy as it sounds, they literally are our country's future. What we do, in our conflict resolution portion of it, in a roundabout way to say it, as simply as I can, is we make ourselves available. We can use the situation and the tragedy down in, Parkland. And, Mr. Cruz, the young man that did the shooting down there, he called the police on himself about how he was having issues. He had the police called on him 39 times. 39. Scott Israel, the sheriff from that Broward, county department, actually made a trip to Mr. Cruz's house in 2016. There was, people calling saying he pointed a firearm at someone's head. Not only was that a felony, which would have stopped him if they would have actually followed through on that. Not only was that a felony, that they could have, stopped him from being even able to purchase a rifle. On top of that, that was a cry for help. So what we do with our organization is we're not one of those gun groups that are not empathetic to serious issues. Sometimes, man, it's something as simple as listening to young people and guiding them. There's a documentary that came out some time ago called Bowling for Columbine. And, Marilyn Manson was asked by, the director, Michael Moore. He said, if you could talk to the students at Columbine, what would you say to them? He said, initially, I wouldn't say anything to them. I would listen, And that's again, as some of these things sound cheesy, but they're extremely impactful, extremely impactful. Just listening. Mr. Cruz was calling out for help, so that's one area of cutting down by listening to people and directing them into spaces where they can be heard and redirect some of that energy into other things. If they have a fascination with firearms, having a young people's group that, goes to shoot and there's camaraderie amongst those things. Turn that into a rites of passage. Turn it into a responsibility for the tool. Turn it into a understanding and getting these things off of these young people's chests so they don't have pent up aggression and frustration. That is very therapeutic, and we need that, especially in urban America. You talk about PTSD. Poor people of all racial backgrounds deal with high levels of stress. You know what I mean? So having those things available and making, at our classes, sometimes we have yoga folks come out. We have psychiatrists come out. We have retired, law enforcement come out, to just give some of the languaging and understanding that's necessary for people to express and be heard and hear and listen.
So I'm wondering how you think about people of color are safe in interacting with law enforcement and things don't happen to them where they're kind of misinterpreted or construed to be dangerous and end up in kind of worse situations than they would be otherwise.
Right. So it's two steps to that. One, the first thing is I want law enforcement officers to be held to the same standard that any concealed carry, permit holder would be held to. If you're in a self-defensive shooting, you have to prove that your life was in imminent danger, not you thought it was. Because I could think it was and shoot somebody, and the jury or the judge can say, well, you're going to jail, right? So it's more about that in that sense of law enforcement. It's not, oh, I feared for my life. Because I could say I feared for my life because I heard a loud shot and I pulled out my gun and shot in the direction that the sound came from. I'm still going to jail. So in that sense, we want law enforcement officers to be, and we don't think that's an extreme standard to be held to if every other American citizen that has a firearm is held to that standard. The other thing is, if you're that nervous and you're that biased, you are not fit to serve as a law enforcement officer, period. Period. You are not fit to serve. Get a different job. If you think that, because this guy's black and he's big and he has a firearm, that means he's a threat, Now, here's where it's our fault, or the onus or the responsibility falls on us. That's the central focus of us doing the work that we're doing at Black Guns Matter. The central focus there is to inform officers, to give them an understanding that if 7 out of 10 of the people that you pulled over happen to be people of color, and if those people of color are licensed firearm owners that speak the language, that don't make furtive movements, that give you an understanding, that know the rules of the game, you now have to change your perception. And if you don't, that is the definition of bias. You have information to the contrary of your incorrect position, but you still choose to hold on to your incorrect position. That is bias. It's an emotional commitment to staying wrong.
Do you think that's why the Philando Castillo shooting was so striking?
Absolutely. And there was enough, in my opinion, Mr. Yanez, because he's not an officer, he murdered Philando Castillo. He did something wrong enough to be fired. Because a lot of officers, not only are they not charged or convicted, they're also not fired. So he did something enough that department said, hey, you can't work here anymore. But I believe that was a homicide. So that's my belief.
So as we're talking about all of this, what's so interesting to me is it feels like a lot of the work that you're doing is very much community-based work and youth-based work in the ways that a lot of people who do this without the intersection with guns do it, right? Like people do this with arts, people do this with other things, just in an attempt to create community space, information sharing, knowledge and resources for folks who may not otherwise have them. And so what I'm wondering is, you've said in the past, I believe, that you don't view Black gun culture and white gun culture as particularly different. So I'm wondering if you still believe that gun culture is not different based on race.
Well, the thing what is different based on race is racism.
Right.
Is bias.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Is bigotry.
Yes.
But that's not what the gun culture is about.
Interesting. How do you separate those things? How are you defining those things differently?
You define it based on, if I'm in a lane, if somebody that happens to be African American is in a lane and they're in a part of the gun culture at a gun range and there's a white guy next to them, those guys are more concerned about, is the person next to me safe? Is the person next to me, going to respect my space while I'm in this lane next to them? That's more of an understanding situation. That's more of a commonality situation. Race don't get in. It's no different than the Eagles. I don't care what part of Philly you were from. When the Eagles won the Super Bowl, we not seeing race at that point. We are on the same team, Team Gun, Team Eagle. Saying that to say that's where it in that culture. But the problem is, we've allowed gun culture and that positive light, that comes from gun culture to not be pop culture anymore. Firearm safety, education, and training should be just as regular as your phone.
Do you think that, so kind of sounds like what you're saying is that gun culture is like a space of equalizing in the way that sports are, and that, it becomes a neutral space where people are focused on the thing that they have in common rather than the differences that they may enter the space into. But I'm wondering if over the last few years, you've seen white folks, fellow gun owners, stand up for the rights of Black people and Black gun owners in the ways that you would anticipate kind of being shared members on Team Gun, as you put it.
Yeah, I see that at state capitals where there's a rainbow coalition damn near of firearm owners. I see that at this, the Second Amendment, it's 2A for everyone's diversity shoots. Black Guns Matter is, an educational organization that's about freedom. I care about if you're safe, you're responsible, you're promoting an informed firearm culture, and if you respect freedoms. If you fall within that, because I got white homies that's more urban than me. You know what I'm saying? Like, they from where I'm from. They from North Philly to the core. They gonna get handled by an ignorant cop the same way that I am. Because they dress like me, they talk like me, they might smell like a pound of weed. They gonna get them same biases. Right? A disrespect for their personal freedoms because of their environment, or because of their conditioning via that environment. So when I see those people all standing up for, the people, the hundreds of thousands of people that support Black Guns Matter, that's down with our cause, that happen to be white, that happen to be Black, those people, those guys and women that know the racist roots of gun control, that say, yeah, that shit is racist, bro. Those people are the people that highlight that,
So as you're talking about this, it sounds like, it makes perfect sense to me that in a one-on-one interaction or in person that you could really find these spaces and find these people. But I'm wondering about the kind of broader conversation that we have around guns in the media and the narratives. It does feel very racially separated. It often feels like those who are given the mic to talk about gun rights and freedoms and the Second Amendment are white and fall more on the conservative end of the political spectrum. And I saw that in February you had taken a break from social media, and I'm wondering how you choose or don't choose to engage with some of the broader narratives, or if you really see your work more locally focused.
It's locally focused work that spreads nationally. Engaging and informing and empowering people locally to their local government is the most revolutionary and solutionary thing that can be done. So it is local, but we travel all over the country to strengthen those local pockets.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. Don't forget that we have another episode regarding gun violence available now with Mike Martin of Raw Tools, everywhere Self-Care Sundays is streaming. I'd also like to thank the person who made our show art, Leah Horowitz, and the amazing artists who make our show music for Real City. On behalf of our producer, Jess Balwar, our communications interns, Kennedy Freeman and Sophie Gomez, our audio engineer, Kato Zane, and myself, thank you for listening. We will see you next week.